How fantastic is that? And I'm now being recorded. I'd like to sign a release form. So welcome to the Carter Presidential Library and Museum. I am Dr. Meredith Evans, director of this side of the house. I'm so grateful that you're here. I'm excited for you to be here. This has been a fantastic program that we've been hosting for a few months now with Mr. Anthony Knight, who is the preservation officer, program officer of the historic preservation section, specifically focuses on African Americans, but just City of Atlanta in general. He's an historian and museum cultural heritage person at heart. So I'm so happy and thrilled that he asked me to help host these particular programs. This is a part of Atlanta history that is oftentimes hidden, but it's worthy of listening to, watching, and having discussions about it. It's important to us. It's important here at the Carter Presidential Library, particularly because President Carter, what's unique about this facility here, this side, is that we show his humble beginnings and his transformation and his changes in views throughout his entire life to the point where he does global work. He did global work for civil and human rights. He does healthcare, election monitoring, all things that he had either positive or negative experiences with. And so when we think about this part of history, I think about all of our roles in making sure that we know and understand, but that we also act differently in the future. So I want to say welcome, and Mr. Anthony Knight, come forward.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Meredith. For those of you who've been here before, you've heard me say that every time I call Meredith and ask if we can do something here, she opens the door. So thank you to you and to your staff here at the Carter Library. As Meredith said, my name is Anthony Knight. No relation to today's speaker, although who knows, given the history of Black folks in this country. But I'm really happy that we have Dr. Frederick Knight with us today, and I'll introduce him in a minute. For those of you who may be new to today's program or to this program series, the city acquired the Chattahoochee Brick Company back in August of 2022. And while the project is going to take a number of years in terms of having the site remediated, figuring out the best way to memorialize the history of the site, and to really figure out three departments in the city, Department of Watershed Management, Department of City Planning, and the Department of Parks and Recreation. Those are the three entities that purchased the site. And those are the three entities that are tasked with determining how best to develop the site. That said, we are working with groups, some local stakeholders, and one representative is here today. Actually, there might be others, but Donna Stevens with the Chattahoochee Brick Company Descendants Coalition. And we're also working with the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And so it's going to take a number of years for us to develop that property into what will be something that all Atlantans can be proud of. But before we get to that step, we thought it might be really good to just kind of take a step back and do a series of programs that help the public understand the site's history in its larger iteration and before it became a site of convict leasing. So those of you who've been here the last two sessions, we had a wonderful keynote by Dr. Clarissa Myrick Harris at Morehouse, who talked about the importance of memorialization. A month ago, we had Dr. James Brooks from UGA, who talked about Native peoples and their relationship to the site and to Georgia in general. And today we have Dr. Frederick Knight, who will talk about the African American story as it relates to not just the site again, but to history of the Atlanta area and Georgia in general. And so that's what this series is about. Next month, we're going to have Dr. Doug Blackman from Georgia State, who's going to talk about 19th century labor, and actually the man who owned the site, the former Atlanta mayor, James English. And then we'll wrap up the site with Dr. Jeffrey Agbar from the University of Connecticut. So we have two more programs after today's program, and we hope you will continue to spread the word and be a part of the series. And as we move forward, we will be doing other educational programming. This is a first effort at that, but over the next year, perhaps even a couple of years, we will continue to offer programming that helps us better understand the site itself, but the history of this city and the state to which the site is, and the country to which the site is connected. So having said that, I will read Dr. Knight's bio, bring him up, and then after we'll have a chance for Q&A, both for Dr. Knight and for those of us here who might be able to answer questions you may have about the site. I know there are a number of my colleagues here. Tamika's here, Susan, Elizabeth, Rachel. So we have a bunch of us here. We have board members. The Chattahoochee Brick Company project has a board. I see a couple of board members here. Ms. Ola, Ms. Peggy Dobbins, and our board chair, David. I saw him over here. So there are a bunch of us here who can maybe answer questions that you may have after Dr. Knight's presentation. So if you bear with me, I will pull this up and we'll get started. And before I read this, I'd like to ask folks if you could please silence your cell phones to make sure that we're not disturbing our speaker. Frederick Knight is professor of history at Morehouse College. He specializes in the history of African Americans and the African diaspora before 1900. Dr. Knight has held fellowships at the Center for Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, the John Nicholas Brown Center for the Study of American Civilization at Brown University, and the University of California, Riverside, where he held the P. Sterling Stuckey postdoctoral fellowship in African American history. Dr. Knight has also served in various capacities with scholarly organizations, including Imagining America, the American Historical Association, and the Omohundro Institute. Professor Knight has published numerous books, book chapters, and articles in his field. Prior to his current book, which literally just came out a couple of months ago, Black Elders, he published Working the Diaspora, the Impact of African Labor on the Anglo-American World, 1650 to 1850. It traces how Africans, though carried across the Atlantic against their wills, drew upon knowledge from their homelands to shape the agricultural and material worlds of New World slave labor camps. Professor Knight received his PhD from the University of California, Riverside. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Frederick Knight.
Thank you all for coming out. It's not lost on me. It's Saturday afternoon. It's beautiful outside, so I appreciate your presence here. And what I want to do is start off with a story that I discovered in the Atlanta History Center archives. It's a plantation was owned by Thomas McGuire in the middle of the 19th century, and during the Civil War, during the war itself, toward the end of the war, African Americans started to leave the plantation. One of the people who left the plantation was an older man by the name of Will. And by fall of 1865, he left. The McGuire stayed and would set up a household for his family. And when he, later on that year into early 1866, he had to return to the McGuire estate. I use the example to provide a sense of the economic and social vulnerability of African Americans throughout the course of the 19th century, even after the 13th Amendment set African Americans free and the Emancipation Proclamation did that. Prior to that, over the course of the 19th century, African Americans had a very precarious material condition. And what I'm going to do over the course of this 25, 30-minute talk is to provide you a sense of that precarity of African American life, labor, as well as the poor of the 19th century, both in the United States as well as a broader Atlantic context in some examples, but with a particular focus on the South. I'm not going to use a couple of examples from Georgia, but I'm going to provide a bit more of a regional study of Southern forced labor to ultimately show how the Chattahoochee Bricks Company was imitation of much of what was going on throughout the South throughout the course of the 19th century. And so again, what I'll be doing is talking about the Southern regional context of the 19th century, the principal institutions, state institutions, as well as corporations, private interests that were involved in this process. And we'll also be looking at and thinking through the role of ideologies around race. Ultimately, the belief that Black people's lives did not matter as much as white people's lives. Labor, how do people organize themselves to extract energy from nature? Poverty, and the ideas about poverty, the value and the worth of poverty, the reasons why people were poor, what should happen to the poor, as well as criminality. What are the reasons that people engage in crime? What are the parameters of crime? And how is the crime implicated into other kinds of aspects of the state, particularly in terms of revenue generation? To give you an overview of what I want to do here, beyond the themes and forces that gave rise to the Chattahoochee Brick Company, what I want to do is give you a sense of the two major time periods that we'll be exploring. The first is the antebellum period, the period before the Civil War, where I'll be looking at questions related to law, labor, and punishment in the antebellum South. Again, the antebellum period is the period before the Civil War, as well as the contest over Black labor during the Civil War itself, and the period of Reconstruction. One historian by the name of Stephen Hahn asked the question, have we missed the biggest slave rebellion in modern history? And what he's referring to is American Civil War, where he argues that because of the scale of slaves running away, enslaved people running away during the Civil War, one perhaps can make the case that it was the biggest slave rebellion in modern history, bigger than even the Haitian Revolution between 1791 and 1804. So first, law, labor, and punishment in the antebellum South. And these were three intertwined historical forces that, again, provided the ideological and institutional foundation for the Chattahoochee Brick Company and the use of convict labor there. First thing, of course, just painting with a broad brush, the historians in recent decades have changed our thinking about what kind of terminology we should use about enslaved labor in the Americas. It was an essay written by a historian by the name of Peter Wood, in a book called Inequality in Early America, where he argued that we should change the term that we use to apply to plantations to the term forced labor camps. Use it in particular a set of forced labor camps in coastal Georgia, which had extraordinarily high infant mortality rates, high levels of violence, and the term forced labor camps, according to Peter Wood, more accurately captures the nature of the lives of the enslaved themselves, comparing them to Russian gulags, as it were. So what do we have? What examples do we have of this, of these forced labor camps? Very clearly, one of the ways that we know that these were forced labor camps was that people were tried to escape. And one historian by the name of Edward Baptist is working on a project called Freedom on the Move. And I was at a conference last weekend in New Orleans, the Organization of American Historians Conference. And if my memory serves me correctly, said that there was somewhere in the order of 200,000 runaway slave ads in the United States. And so the fact that people were trying to run away is a clear evidence that these were forced labor camps. Of course, enslaved labor engaged in all manner of work, not only in agricultural labor, but in other kinds of work as well. And so what we see here is an advertisement from here in Georgia of an enslaved figure by the name of Jerry, who ran away. He was about 40 years old. And his occupation, unlike what we normally think of as enslaved labor on plantations like we see here in Virginia, was that of working on a steamer. But again, this evidence of runaway slave advertisements, thousands upon thousands of advertisements that we have, is very clear evidence of this phenomena of enslavement, plantations as forced labor camps. And this phenomenon would continue into the postbellum period. We also have the question of forced migration. I just want to throw out a statistic here that historians have as a result of evidence that historians have unearthed about the scale of forced migration between 3 years after the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the beginning of the Civil War, so that between 1790 and 1860, there were 1 million slave sales across state lines. Between 1820 and 1860, that number was about 600,000 some odd enslaved people. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this, at the time of the Civil War, there were 4 million enslaved people, which meant that at the time of the Civil War, if one was an enslaved person, had either been sold or knew somebody who was. It was most likely that would have been the case for oneself. So this interstate enslaved trade, this practice of forced migration, is another layer of this history of forced labor of African descended people in the Americas. I want to shift my discussion to another labor strategy that planters use that is also related to the question of the convict leasing system, established something of a precedent for the use of forced labor in a way that was comparable to the convict lease system. And that was a system of hiring out. What was the system of hiring out? Hiring out was a system of forced labor during the period of slavery and the antebellum period, through which planters who owned enslaved people would essentially lease slaves out. This was not an uncommon phenomenon at all. And what we see here is an image of Harriet Jacobs, who was an enslaved woman in North Carolina. She would run away from slavery and write her autobiography. It was published in 1861, and she talks about New Year's and as a time which we might think of as a time of celebration, and she talks about this as a time of mourning and grief for African Americans. This is an excerpt from her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, when she says that hiring day at the South takes place on the 1st of January. On the 2nd, the slaves are expected to go to their new masters. At the appointed hour, the grounds are thronged with men, women, and children, waiting like criminals to hear their doom pronounced. The slave is sure to know who was the most humane or cruel master within 40 miles of him. And so this phenomena of hiring enslaved people out was fairly commonplace here. And this was, again, if we look at this document here, which is pulled from the Virginia Historical Society, the George family papers here, we just get a sense of kind of the mundane, everyday, ordinary, quotidian nature of this phenomena. Here we see a list of Negro hires for 1842. And we can see the names of the individuals and the price, the rate at which these people were leased out for the year. So we see 100, 70, 40, 50. And so this would be a way for planters, the planter class of Virginia and elsewhere, to bring in additional revenue, to supplement other kinds of income they were generating from the agriculture or other kinds of labor that enslaved people were doing on their forced labor camps. And so this is 1842. This is just one example of a whole host of lists from this family. So again, this phenomena of leasing out forced labor in the South, you see precedents for it during the antebellum period. This fairly widespread phenomena, economic strategy, as it were, that planters use in order to optimize and maximize their profits and their revenue, and to ultimately make money on the margins. So ultimately, that's what the objective was in the use of this strategy. This was also used here in the state of Georgia. I provide examples from Harriet Jacobs, her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, where she talks about hiring out in coastal North Carolina. I use an example of the George family estate in Virginia. But we also see this being the case here in the state of Georgia. In the 1830s, this federal government set up a fort right at the head of the Savannah River on the which became known as Fort Pulaski. And what we see here is essentially a job ad, but it's a job ad of a different stripe. And so what it says here is that on the 2nd of August, 1836, wages will be paid for prime slaves on the fortifications at Cockspur Island. From the 14th instant, will be fixed at $14 per month and found, the owner to lose runaway time only, and the government to furnish what does that say?
Physician.
Oh, physician, I'm sorry, and the medicine. Any slave can be withdrawn from the works in 1 day's notice. Again, so what we see here is this practice of convict, in this case, slave being leased. We see a collusion, as it were, between the state and private interests, which is also one of the critical features of the convict leasing system as well. So, in other words, what we see are plenty of precedents and practices, policies that went into the infrastructure of the antebellum South. And so what we see here is for Pulaski, but what we also see here is one of the bricks. Oops. And I'm not sure what I have a laser pointer here, but what we see here, if we look at the bricks very carefully, are actually the imprints of fingers on these bricks. And this is not unusual. I have a colleague who's done some historical consulting work at Montpelier Estate in Virginia, which is the estate of the fourth president of the United States, James Madison. And what he's found is that you similarly see fingerprints on the bricks of in the structures of Montpelier estates that were quite, that indicates the presence of slave labor producing the bricks for that estate. And some of these fingerprints are the fingerprints of children. And so this is the history of forced labor in the American South. And the use, this is an example of the use of forced labor here in the state of Georgia, that in ways that were not unlike what would happen after the Civil War. Now, another element of forced labor in the 19th century that's important for us to pay attention to, and this is related to our earlier issue I wanted to raise about the question of how do you deal with the poor. In the 19th century, particularly the 1830s in England and in the broader Atlantic world, there was an ideological shift about how the state should deal with the poor. During the 18th century, the 1700s, poor in many cases would get out what's called out relief, which is basically cash payments, and so they would use that to survive. But during the 19th century, there was a more stringent policy in England and the broader Atlantic world about how to deal with the poor and the rise of not just poor houses, but workhouses. So in other words, the poor had to pay their keep through labor. We see here on the left the image of a workhouse in England. What we see here on the right is an image of the workhouse in Charleston, South Carolina. So these workhouses were places that people who had committed perhaps petty crime, runaway slaves, others who were poor, perhaps vagrants in cities like Charleston and New Orleans, would end up having to land and engaging in labor that required them essentially to pay for their keep. So that's another frame, institutional frame we need to bear in mind as we think about the evolution of convict leasing at the Chattahoochee Brick Company. Now, what I want to then finally, the last major issue I want to talk about here is relates to the antebellum period, and that's thinking about questions related to the role of the state, more specifically, in criminal law, by pointing out a couple of examples from not Georgia, but from Louisiana. And again, this is about mimicry. Georgia very much saw, or in Atlanta, as it emerged in the wake of the Civil War, saw itself as trying to take the lead in the South, and they had precedents in other antebellum cities. And so I want to point to New Orleans and talk about some of the issues that, again, helps to explain why something like convict leasing would emerge. And that is tax policy. That southern states, and the state of Louisiana in particular, was just very, very cheap when it came to taxes. For example, if you look at and compare the upper tax rate of the elite in Manhattan and compare it to the elite in New Orleans, the elite in Manhattan paid essentially a 10 times higher tax rate than those in New Orleans. And so how did Louisiana state government, how the New Orleans city government run. What kind of revenue did they use in order to run their governments? Well, one of the things they relied heavily upon was licensing fees. So 1854, they brought in about $1.19 million in licensing fees, which is about 4 times the amount of fees that they brought in real estate taxes. You get a license if you were a doctor, if you were wanting to sell insurance. If you owned a coffee house, you had to pay a license and such. Another way that they generated revenue and that the poor had to pay for their own self or their own suffering was through people at the time, and they should have 2 C's, were peccadillos, these small little sins, disturbing the peace. Thomas Clark was fined for having no place of abode, for sleeping under the platform of a railroad line there in New Orleans. In the theaters of New Orleans, if you entered the theater, you didn't pay, you would be fined. If you sat with a hat on while after the curtain raised, you'd be fined $50. And if you were a black person in that theater sitting in a white person's seat, you would be fined. There were a group of women who were fined for not sweeping in front of their homes before 10 a.m., which was required for all residents. They complained, and they got fined for, you bet you, disturbing the peace. And so this is the kind of draconian tax as well as criminal policies that the New South would inherit. And that's what I want to move to next. But this was also a period of intense contestation over Black labor. And so, in other words, the rise of the convict leasing system was not necessarily inevitable, but rather was a result of a set of failed experiments, I would say failed policy, one might argue, as well as this kind of ideology about what the proper place of labor should be. And so let's start with the Civil War, and this is, I need days upon days to talk about this story, but the key I want us to bear in mind here during the Civil War was that slavery and forced labor was about containment. It was about keeping Black people in a particular place engaged in agricultural and other kinds of production. And so with the entry of Union forces into the Confederacy, Black people were on the move. They were finding their way to Union lines. As I mentioned earlier, this historian Stephen Hahn made the case that perhaps this Civil War marked the biggest slave rebellion in modern history. And so you see this panic set in among the white nationalist planter class of the South. And so Thomas McGuire, who was the owner of Will, who I mentioned earlier, talks about and writes in his diary that we have lots of rumors of Negroes trying to get to the Yankees. In Virginia, the father of Maxwell Clark of Virginia said, "Oh, my God, my dear son, you little dream of our wretched condition here. Our Negroes are leaving in a week. I doubt if there will be 100 Negroes left." And so there's this fear, this panic that set in as the old order was collapsing. And so the question then became for people during that time period is what's going to be the new legal status of African Americans as the old order was crumbling. And one thing was clear, was that in mass, slavery was over, in mass. So the 4 million people were enslaved in 1860, that the ability for people to have a title, legal title in that person and transfer that title either to another person or across generations, that was over for the most part. But as we see here now, imagine that Professor Blackman will refer to in his lecture, that there was a loophole, as it were, and that is that the 13th Amendment said that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And so this was a period, again, of great possibilities and great hope for African Americans. They were moving, they were trying to unite with family members. They wanted to buy or acquire land. There were promises of land redistribution in some circles. But ultimately, what would emerge would be the fundamental form of reorganizing Black labor, and that is the right to contract. And so while African Americans had aspirations for other ways and beliefs about and ideas about what freedom meant to them, particularly education and land ownership, what the United States South, as well as the Freedmen's Bureau, would land on was a labor regime that was grounded in labor contracts. And what we see here is an image of a labor contract from 1866 in Kentucky. And what the Freedmen's Bureau did, this federal bureau that was set up to deal with a whole host of things. They set up schools, set up hospitals. One of the things they did was negotiate labor contracts between planters who had the land, former planters, former slaveholders who had the land, and then former enslaved people who had the labor. And so these labor contracts would provide some guarantee of wages, as well as some degree of modicum of protection against abuse. And you see cases of the Freedmen's Bureau or enslaved former freedmen and women going to the Freedmen's Bureau asking for some kind of relief from their the person on whose land they worked. But this became the central organizing principle, and this became one of the limits. Again, I'm trying to give you a sense of both the greater empowerment that Black people felt at this time, but also vulnerability, because the labor contract ultimately depended upon the landowner. There was an element of financial dependency that was not broken during the period of Reconstruction. Now, one of the things that we saw also emerging in the wake of the Civil War was a set of laws you saw throughout the South. Mississippi probably had the most draconian, most severe Black codes. And their Black codes, for example, required Black people to sign a labor contract. They had to. So now Black people have the right to sign a contract. Mississippi State, now you have to sign a labor contract. If you don't, then you have to work for the state, forced labor. Now, not only did the Mississippi Black Code say that you have to use a Black person, and they said Black, if you sign a labor contract, your children are also required to work for the person that you as an adult work for. So not only did it bind adults to these contracts, but it bound their children, which resembled very much the system of slavery for former freedmen, for former slaves, for the freedmen and women of Mississippi. We also see this in the South. The Georgia Code of 1866 would impose harsh penalties, quote, on all persons leading an idle, immoral, or profligate life who have no property to support them and are able to work and do no work. So these would be criminal penalties, not just fines that would be levied upon those who cannot. And if you were penalized with a fine, that became essentially de facto a fine or a punishment of forced labor, because a lot of people didn't have money to pay the fine. And so how do you pay out the fine is through forced labor. Now, some of those codes were short-lived as a result of the 14th Amendment, which would say that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So essentially, the 14th Amendment required the Southern states to throw out their Black codes for the most part. That's what it did. But again, the old plantation order was persistent. And there were laws that stayed on the books, such as vagrancy laws. And so with the vagrancy laws, what we see here was a requirement that people who were subject to these vagrancy laws were required to work on the public works or roads for no longer than a year, or be bound to some person for a time not longer than 1 year. This is from the Floria's Chain and Silence, a book I would highly recommend if you want to know more things more deeply about the experience of women in forced labor in the state of Georgia, which is the focus of that work. So I want to draw some broad conclusions. I provide you, kind of peppered you with a lot of information here, and what I want to do is kind of draw these threads together so that we have a sense of how this all adds up. And so what I'm trying to make the case here is that there's a process of mimicry, that these past inheritances created a formula, as it were, for convict leasing. And so first you have the precedent in law of forced labor as punishment for crime or poverty. We saw that in the workhouses of Charleston and New Orleans. We have the history of leasing of Black labor. We saw that at George Family Plantation. We saw that at Fort Pulaski. We have the law of peccadillos. You know, people getting fined for sweeping in front of their home, not sweeping in front of their homes, and then fined for disturbing the peace for protesting such things. There's a legacy of tax evasion in the South that is also something that formed the creation of the convict leasing. And then the new status of African Americans as landless, contract workers, and labor vulnerability all created this kind of toxic formula that helped create the conditions, didn't necessarily cause, but create the conditions for the rise of the convict leasing system that we saw at the Chattahoochee Bricks Company. And so I want to leave with a quote here from the African-American historian W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, Black Reconstruction, where he says that the slave, when freed, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. And I think that sums up the forces that would give rise to the convict leasing system. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
I had thought it was mostly men who would be arrested for vagrancy, but you seem to refer to women also being punished in a similar way.
Yeah, Talita LaFloria's book on her book Chain and Silence talks about the experience of women in the criminal justice system at the turn of the late 19th and early 20th century. And so, although they may not have been charged for vagrancy, they were fined for, they were charged for these peccadillos, right? And so it's an in-depth study of that phenomenon. And her case is that around 90%, however, of those who were in the convict leasing system were men. Still, there were about 10%, I think that's the number that she gives us, of the convict leasing labor force in, I'm not sure it was Georgia or the South, were women. Any questions? Yes.
You briefly mentioned what I heard about income taxes on state level, like you were talking about Louisiana.
Right.
But, and I did want to ask you how that worked with respect to the Chattahoochee Break.
Okay.
But also just clarity that there was not an income tax imposed by the federal government until the 20th century.
Yeah, when I'm referring to taxes, I'm not referring to income taxes. I'm referring to property taxes. And so essentially Louisiana, and that's the case I know best. They set up a system where essentially property values were frozen at a certain year. So if you own a property in 1820, 1830, then in 1850, you still be taxed at the 1820 value of that property, which meant that your taxes did not go up as your value of your property went up, which created these massive kind of inequalities in terms of, you know, rich versus, essentially rich were not taxing themselves in the state in comparison to a city like Manhattan, which had, in terms of real estate taxes, much higher tax rate, and other kinds of taxes, much higher tax rate than Louisiana or the city of New Orleans. And so that's the point I was making about Louisiana in comparison to the state of New York. So I was referring to income taxes.
But you're saying it was real estate, but not the bigger sense of property.
But it was real estate that was the principle in terms of taxation. That was what principally was taxed. But again, if one looks at the city of New Orleans, in 1854, they brought in 1853, they brought on $960,000 in revenue through licensing. And they brought in about $250,000 in real estate taxes. And so again, the case there is that, and the licensing fees were fees on middling and lower class folks, barbers, people who use carts, physicians, lawyers, some of those were more well-to-do, people who own coffee houses. And so there was this, among the Louisiana kind of bourbon elite, this aversion to taxing themselves at a higher rate. And so it gives, again, an example of that tax disparity or disparity in how the state and for whom the state brought in revenue. In the city of New Orleans between 1836 and 1851, the city brought in about $360,000 in revenue from coffee houses. During that same time period, they brought in about $23,000 from merchants. And so about $360,000 in revenue from coffee houses between 1836 and 1851 over the course of that 15-year time period. During that same time period, around $23,000 were brought in from merchants. So you're talking about 1.5 times more revenue came in from coffee houses in New Orleans than merchants. And this is like, I mean, cotton was flowing in and out, sugar was flowing in and out of New Orleans during this time period. This was the port that cotton that was coming down from Mississippi, from Natchez, from Texas, Western Tennessee, Eastern, you get it. And so New Orleans was the place to be if you're a merchant.
Wow.
And so that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of this tax aversion. And so how are you going to raise revenue? You do it through licensing. You essentially tax the middle class and the poor with these peccadillos. That's the broader argument I'm trying to make here. That helps to explain why then you have a convict leasing system, which is also a revenue generator for the state. And you lease out slaves, or lease out convicts, and that brings in cash from industry that's gonna fork over the cash to the state or the things that the state does.
Thank you.
Is that
You got it.
okay? I didn't think you had another question, but
We're good.
we're good. Yes.
Did you find in your research that in the late 1800s that most of the convict labor were from these peccadillos or were they actual criminals to the extent?
It's a combination, yeah, and Douglas Blackman, he'll probably be able to spell that out, but you have a whole host of, if you look at the list of what people were being convicted for, you have people who are convicted for violent crimes. You have those who are convicted for, we think of as non-violent crimes or petty crimes or vagrancy, which is kind of vague catch-all term. I think the numbers are around 2/3 of people who are steered in the convict leasing system were on the kind of picadillo side of things.
During your research, when do you see the rise of penitentiaries in the state of Georgia?
I don't know penitentiaries in the state of Georgia. I don't know that. But the penitentiaries are the 19th century phenomenon. There's a different idea of how to punish people, punish them. And a notion was that rather than use other forms of punishing people in the 17th to 18th century, breaking people to the wheel, all those kind of very public, graphic forms of punishing people to send a message to the rest of the community what will happen to oneself if one, or putting people in stocks. Rather than having those very public displays of punishment, what emerged in the course of the 19th century were forms of punishment that were thought to be more enlightened, and one that would have at least a philosophical underpinning that said that a person should penance, like penitentiary, like penance, they should do penance, and so there should be an element where they have to examine their conscience. And that's why people were isolated, put in cells, to spend that time in penance, to reflect upon on the crimes that they had committed. And so that emerged in cities like Philadelphia, other cities around the Atlantic Basin, and then in terms of its history and its rise in the state of Georgia, I'm not quite sure of, but that's its genealogy in that ideological frame. And I also must say, I studied Georgia, but that's not my area of expertise. I'm more of a generalist, African-American 19th century historian. Yes. Yes.
So the inception of the vagrancy laws, was that post-Reconstruction in terms of like, I know that when the Jim Crow laws came along and you could literally be inducted into that convict leasing for playing checkers with someone, a white person playing checkers with a white person. When did those really, the inception of the Jim Crow laws and the vagrancy laws, did those kind of duck out? And then I know that actually the Nazi movement studied the Jim Crow laws when they get implemented the Nuremberg laws. They came over here and studied them.
Yeah, that is correct. The latter is correct. In terms of the former, the vagrancy laws date at least back to late 18th century. So again, what we're talking about here is thinking about this question of precedent. It's an inheritance of laws, of practices, of ways of thinking about the poor, ways of thinking about criminality, ways of thinking about Black people, ways of thinking about masculinity, all those kind of things. And so the vagrancy system had been around. And it's an application of it in a particular place in the New South context of Atlanta and of Georgia that makes this particular context unique. I thought I saw a hand over here. Yes.
Can you speak to the question of when color becomes so salient?
Wow. Yeah, that's a good question. Some people mark it at 1640. 1640.
1640.
Some people mark it at 1640. This is how can I keep this simple? Because it's complicated history. This legal status of people of African descent for the first couple of decades in British North America, the Virginia colony, Maryland and such, had not quite been set in stone. So we know that early on, there were some people of African descent who became property owners, they acquired land, they even had forced labor, some even owned slaves themselves, right? So there's that history. So But that window was very small. It lasted maybe 30 or 40 years between, we say, 1620 and 1660. There was a period in which there was some upward mobility of African Americans where their status and their condition had not quite been cemented. But by 1660, certainly there was a case in 1640, a major court case. It's called the John Punch case, it's known as. John Punch case. And this is a case of a black man by the name of John Punch ran away with two others, Victor and Hugo, I believe. No, Victor and Hugh. They were white. They both ran away. They were in Virginia trying to get to Maryland. They got caught, brought before a judge. And the judge gave the Scotch and the Dutch man 4 additional years, 3 for the master and 1 for the state. John Punch got a life sentence. So that's number one. Number two, by 1661, 1662, Virginia and Maryland are making clear distinctions about what the legal status of black people was going to be: Negro, slave, durante vita, during life. And so there was a window of about 40 years where there was some, I might use a word, kind of color blindness. I struggle with that, but it was short. And then by 1661, then you have another 2 centuries of color is going to be one of the principal between 1660 and 1860, the Civil War. 2 centuries where very clearly the state in its laws, the Virginia Code of 1661 and 1662, the 1680 Code, the 1691 Code, the 1705 Code are saying this is the Negro and this is what their status is. For life, chattel, meaning property, and the status of a person, slave or free, is through the condition of the mother. And that would be the laws that would then be replicated in Mississippi and Alabama when they became states.
That point about the status of the mother, that's the point that I remember honing in on. And I don't have precise knowledge about it.
Yeah, that's the legal fiction. That's the legal revolution that happened. It was a legal revolution that happened in the middle of the 17th century. And the revolution was that before in England, one's legal status was determined by the status of the father. But for the purposes of the invention of race and slavery in the Americas and the creation of that, then there was this legal revolution that now the status of a child, slave or free, would be determined by the status of the mother. And so in this new world colonial context,
it's explicit to, the status of the mother is explicit to persons who are enslaved or persons who are African.
Persons who are enslaved. And in the same law, it said that this would be limited to, the term was Negro.
It said that.
In the law. It says this, you can
And
go.
that's in the Virginia law?
You can go into the Virginia's code. You can look at the codes of 1661 and 1662, and then you can look at subsequent codes in 1680, 1691, 1705, and the term, it's in the code.
Do you have an article that says what you just said?
Maybe I'll be around afterwards, maybe I can give you some references that may be helpful. How about that?
Thank you. That's
Okay.
very
You
good.
can go to the Africans in America. The Africans in America documentary would be quite good. The first episode, Terrible Transformation. Take out Africans in America, watch the episode, The Terrible Transformation. It's the first episode of the documentary, Africans in America. That provides, and the information hasn't been updated since that documentary, for the most part, at least in terms of the law.
Film documentary?
It's a documentary film, PBS documentary. Check that out, I would say. Yes, please.
She was making a reference to a case called Dobbs, Dobbs,
Jackson. Anyway, they talked about taking advantage of the status of a woman, that her children would be based off of her status, if she was a slave or free. And that stemmed from a black woman who went to court, her name was Gadot, and she sued the state for freedom of her children and was successful.
Yeah.
And after that, they came out and said, no, we're gonna stop that.
Yeah.
And that's a direct correlation to treating women as property. So if they were raped, if they incest, any kind of health of the mother, they had no rights over their body.
Yeah.
Sound familiar?
Yeah, this is Elizabeth
This is
Key.
what is steeped in
Yeah.
treating all women today as black women were treated during slavery.
And that's the Elizabeth Key case.
Yes.
The Elizabeth Key case, and so this is a woman who had had a child with a English colonist, and the question that became was whether that child was slave or free. She took that case through the courts of colonial Virginia, and she won the case. But then, in order to stop that, then the colonial government codified it. And so this is code. This is code, and we say this in terms of law, but I think just the metaphor of like computer code. Once you run it, it just keeps going.
Wow.
And so that's what we see here, and then there will be tweaks and refinements and 2.0 and 2.5 over time. And so 1680 became like slavery slave code 1.3. It's not, of course, equate coding to what's happening in that industry with this, but in terms of a metaphor, I think it's helpful for us to think through
There's
what's
also a
happening
point
here.
on that, sir.
Okay,
Race and technology, great book.
so any other, yes,
For those who were forced into labor at the Chattahoochee Grid site over time, do we have a sense, and this might be a question for anyone in the room, do we have a sense for what percentage were men, women, and kids?
I don't know those numbers.
I think that's really more of a Doug Blackman question than that's.
Yes, here and here.
Hi. So I was curious, just talking about the history of taxation and economic development, particularly in the South. I know that there were, I believe it was, two different stock market crashes or economic crises in the 1800s. I think maybe one was 1847 and then one in 73. Does any of that correlate to the sort of precedent that's set on how convict leasing became standard practice? Because you have all of these, you talked about the taxation and how they're generating all this wealth for themselves, and that's causing economic crises similar to what we saw in 2008, right? But just instead of housing markets, it's enslavement. So I'm curious if that's connected in any way to the precedent that's set.
Yeah, that's good. That's a really interesting question. I haven't really thought about that because United States it went through boom bust. So 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, I think 1893. So there was this boom bust cycle, and there were these bank panics. And so then if the question then becomes is how is the state going to have a reliable source of revenue? Then is this a way to generate reliable forms of revenue? I haven't thought through that, but that's interesting, a hypothesis. But I haven't really thought along those lines. I think it is important for us to know that, however, in particular in relation to this moment, is that the economic crisis in the early 1870s did create this exhaustion of the United States in the Reconstruction project. And so at that point, because of the economic anxieties that people were feeling, as well as some of the corruption that was happening at the federal level, there was a sense that the United States is going to withdraw support from this process, which again created this field of vulnerability. I would probably think there's a stronger case for that as it relates to convict leasing, but perhaps there's something to your theory about boom bust and tax aversion and all that. Yeah, how did the government fund itself? You know, the South relied very heavily on things like lotteries during the antebellum period. So again, at a conference last week, it was a fascinating talk about lotteries as a way of raising money and the fairly austere approach to taxation is again tied to things like why was there no public education for even white kids in the South before Reconstruction? So it's fascinating history. I have another right here. No, can I get this other friend back here? Yes, sir. Yes.
You showed the black codes earlier.
Yeah.
From Georgia, and clearly that's a reaction to the 13th Amendment. But I was curious, the verbiage of it is kind of so open. Were there other groups or minorities that were affected by that?
Yes, but they were, but there's clear bias in the numbers that really they showed in terms of the actual people who were prosecuted for such crime that it's important to know that.
Yeah, it seems so sweeping, but clearly there was the timing about this.
Yes, it's the question then, because this is the code, but then the question then becomes enforcement. And there's going to be a gap between the code and enforcement, which is kind of a gap around race. You have a question here, and then we can start right. Yes. Yes. Yes.
It's actually kind of similar to your question. My understanding is that in Atlanta, when like enslaved labor kind of ticked up was in the 1830s when they were building the road embankment. And the reason that happened was originally Irishmen who were building it, and then there was a collapse in cotton prices, like in the 1830s, that caused all these planters to want to license out their enslaved people, and so that is how they came to work on their own thing. And so it was interesting when you showed the Fort Pulaski example. That request for licensed labor, that was around the same time. And so I'm just curious that like cotton price collapse, how widespread was that? Was that like Georgia? Was that like the South?
I can't get to that level, that kind of granular
That's
detail.
that's totally fine.
Yeah.
And then that was like that's
Yeah. So this late 1830s, that may have been tied to the broader economic crisis of the late 1830s. I'm scanning my memory. Edward Baptist has never been told, and he has a bunch of charts on cotton prices and stuff.
That answers my question. If like this was not like a huge thing, this was like kind of specific to this example.
Okay, so you had another question, and I'll let you.
Yeah. I wanted to seize the moment of two young people focusing in on something that 40 years ago when I was an academic, I tried to call attention to, and that was a correlation in the point of the capitalist cycle when there is a fall in the rate of profit. And it happened to correlate with 3 times there were feminist pushes, impetuses. And I don't know if y'all use the term industrial reserve labor force anymore, but and I didn't work on that in relation to black labor. I was working on it in relation to feminism and women being drawn in. But I hope that you all, I'm really excited to hear you raise that. I can't do work on that anymore, but I hope that you all will.
Was there any effort for the federal government or the state governments for education? Were there any programs started up for formerly enslaved people after the Civil War? Because I was thinking about people experiencing these forces, but not having the narrative that you presented, not understanding that they didn't know about codes maybe, or they didn't know about some of the laws, but they would experience the forces of it, but needed probably desperately as well to the education to make a narrative understanding of that.
Yeah, that's it. I heard two things. One is like a legal education around the law, but more general questions related to education. Is it the former or the latter that you're interested in, or both?
Well, just forces, understanding the forces, you would experience the codes, but you may not have known about codes. But if you've been in school, maybe you had some idea.
Okay, I see. Okay, the history of Black education predated the Civil War, and it was first antidotes or first strategy of seeing education as being essential for African Americans and their newly free status happened in the northern states as they began to end slavery after the American Revolution. And so there were schools established in New York, and Boston, Philadelphia. There was an organization called the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which was established in Pennsylvania around 1790 or so. And as Pennsylvania abolished slavery gradually in 1780, what the Pennsylvania Abolition Society was to do, what they did was to support the development of schools. And so you saw that very early on after the American Revolution. Then during the Civil War, even before the 13th Amendment was ratified, a group of missionaries would go to the southern territory that had been captured, in particular the Sea Islands of South Carolina, where they would begin to establish schools. So missionary schools started to emerge in the coastal parts of South Carolina, and then that would expand during the period right after the Civil War. The federal government set up freedmen schools. Some of these schools are still around. Howard University in Washington, D.C., the school from which the Vice President of the United States graduated, Fisk University in Nashville. These were all freedmen schools funded by the federal government, and ultimately were passed on to other less federal support over time. So that's one means. And then another means were missionaries who set up schools throughout the South, some of which were K through 12, or normal schools. And then they set up schools that ultimately became institutions of higher education. So that's another stream of the establishment of schools. And this was something that African Americans hungered for. I mentioned W.B. Du Bois in the last slide here in his book, Black Reconstruction. And he said that former slaves wanted two things. They wanted land and they wanted education. He said that African Americans wanted to learn that Kabbalistic, he uses Kabbalistic language, like the secret language. There's something in on those documents. There's something in those secrets that are being kept in those books and those log books and in the Bible, in the state laws and such, that Black people wanted to learn how to crack those codes, as it were. And so with both that desire of African Americans for education, as well as these institutional supports from missionaries, as well as the federal government, you saw the rise of education in the South. In fact, the South did not have a systematic public education system until after the Civil War. And it was a result of that hunger and an alliance by former slaves as well as white allies in the South that would establish the foundation for public education in the South. So yes, there was an effort for that, but then there was the countervailing pull of labor. So the question then becomes, for a family, if you're signed a labor contract, then how much time is your child going to spend in school? You're going to try to have your child spend as much time in school as possible. Or, if harvest comes in, then how much is the child going to be pulled into that? And so that's something I think we also have to bear in mind in terms of the broader context within which people are operating. Is that? Yes.
To kind of go off of your response there, I have a question about Black education and literacy and the labor context,
Sure.
or contracts. Just because how did that work if people maybe didn't know how to read, and they're signing these legal documents?
That's a good that's a good question. It's, Freedmen Bureau agents were intermediaries. So just imagine, even though a free person did not know how to read, there may be people in the community who knew how to read. So that's one, but if that was not the case, then the Freedmen Bureau agent's responsibility was to be the interlocutor between the landowner and the former slave or that individual and their family. So, well, sounds like that's about it. Yeah, that's about it. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Fred, for a really interesting talk. Appreciate it. And for your questions and thoughtful comments. Thank you all. I don't know if anyone has any questions before we kind of wrap up for today, any kind of broad questions about the Chattahoochee Brick Company project or anything related to what we might be involved in. Yes, ma'am.
No, when we get some specifics about the Chattahoochee Brick Company and the surrounding areas, figures, statistics, stories relating to African Americans and the relationship to that community.
In terms of the brick company,
I want to
okay,
learn historically about African Americans and the Chattahoochee Brick Company.
understood. So we are working on that now. I mean, we literally are planning how we move forward. We're trying to figure out who the scholars are that we need to involve in this project. And what I can say is that it will not be an overnight project. We just don't have a timeline right now for any of that. There's some general information out there. I know Fred referenced Doug Blackman's work, Salifia LaFleur's work as well. There is information out there, but in terms of the city being able to put forth a document or something of that nature, we are a good little while from that. But there is information out there. I don't know if someone else has a question.
Can I help address some of that from the
Sure.
center perspective? So I represent the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and so there's a research component to the project that we're working on in collaboration with the city to help inform the public about specifics on the Chattahoochee Brick site. So one of those is research, and so we're going to be working to give those stories out to the public as we're discovering them. We do have right now a research advisory group. It does include Doug Blackman, also includes Dr. Euphoria and also Dr. Meyer Paris. So all of them are working in tandem to come up with both the economic impact of the Chattahoochee Brick site, the personal impact of the victims of convict leasing, and so all those things will be available to the public as that research continues to
Is there a broad timeline?
So right now, we're trying to work through getting a student researcher group together. We're working in tandem with New York State, which is where the Black researchers and also parts of the ABC. So once we have that, that is set to begin in September. And so then those facts will start to come out with that advisory group towards the latter part of the year once they can start. So that's our running time right now. Yeah.
Is there a reason? I'm just curious. Is there something that you are looking for or something that you're hoping to see or understand? Or is it just knowledge?
No, I was just seeking some knowledge. And because I just read the flyer, my interpretation, I just want to learn about African Americans in that community and the influence, some facts and figures regarding. I appreciate the broad brush, but I was looking at a little more focused on the Chattahoochee Brick Company.
So I don't know what document said facts or figures. That I don't remember. I don't know about that.
No, she covered it.
No, I'm just saying on the flyer that you're talking about, that I don't know about that. But
Oh, no, your flyer didn't say.
Oh, okay, I was
You
wondering.
just said Chattahoochee Brick Company. Said African.
So these are meant to be a very general look, not only at the Chattahoochee Brick Company site, but the history that is part of the site. So that's what these are meant to be. These are not meant to be deep dives in specific history as it relates to Chattahoochee Brick Company, but the external forces and the history of this area, the city, and the country that impacted the site, that would impact the site, and the development of a site like that. That's what, no, just want to, make it clear, that's what these are meant to be. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, a good starting place maybe next month, when we have Bud Black with us, who will be able to answer your specific questions as they pertain to the challenge.
What is the date?
What's the date?
May 11th, Saturday, May 11th, here from 1 to 3. And the speaker who will speak in June, the June 15th speaker, Dr. Agbar from the University of Connecticut, has a book out, America's Black Capital, which focuses on specifically Black history, the history of Black people in Atlanta. And he's going to be talking about, not only the Chattahoochee Brick Company site, but the impact of that kind of industry on the city of Atlanta and what it meant for that city as it developed into what it has become. That's Saturday, June 15th, correct. Again, 1 to 3 here at the Carter Library. And we do have some poster boards out in the lobby. If you've not seen them, they provide some, again, just kind of general information about the site. And there are some statistics, I believe, on those as well. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I heard at the beginning that this was being recorded. Is that recording available to the public?
Yes, we will make it available. Any other thoughts? Oh, I'm sorry. Was there another?
No, you were good. You mentioned it.
Okay. Are we on? Good morning.